Let's now cut across to London, where Prime Minister Boris Johnson is addressing the House of Commons.
Commentary on the respective military potential power of the Taliban and the Afghan forces. It's pretty clear from what has happened that the collapse of the Afghan forces has been much faster than expected. And as for our NATO allies and allies around the world, when it came for us to look at the options that this country might have in view of the American decision to withdraw, Mr. Speaker, we came up against this hard reality that since 2009, America has deployed 98% of all weapons released from NATO aircraft in Afghanistan, and at the peak of the operation, when there were 132,000 troops on the ground, 90,000 of them, Mr. Speaker, were American. The West could not continue this US-led mission, a mission conceived and executed in support and defence of America, without American logistics, without US air power, and without American might. And I do not believe. I give way with pleasure.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. I note the point that he's making about the importance of American support for our efforts in Afghanistan and those of our allies. But will he please set out when he first spoke personally to Jens Stoltenberg, Secretary-General of NATO, to discuss with him the possibility of putting together an alliance of other forces in order to replace the American support in Afghanistan?
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend. I spoke to Secretary-General Stoltenberg the other day about NATO's continuing role in Afghanistan, but I really think that it is an illusion to believe that there is appetite amongst any of our partners for a continued military presence or for a military solution imposed by NATO in Afghanistan, Mr. Speaker. That idea ended with the combat mission in 2014, and I do not believe that today, I do not believe that deploying tens of thousands of British troops to fight the Taliban is an option that, no matter how sincerely people may advocate it, and I appreciate their sincerity, but I do not believe that that is an option that would commend itself either to the British people or, Mr. Speaker, to this House. Mr. Speaker, we must deal with the position as it now is, accepting what we have achieved and what we have not achieved. And I will give way to the right honourable lady.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way. He seemed to be making an argument earlier that he had anticipated something similar to what went on by having the rapid response force ready and waiting. Why then was he and the Foreign Secretary both on their holidays when this catastrophe happened?
Mr. Speaker, the government has been working round the clock to deal with the unfolding situation, and we must deal with the world as it is, accepting what we have achieved and what we have not achieved. And the UK will work with our international partners on a shared plan to support the people of Afghanistan and to contribute to regional stability. There will be 5 parts, Mr. Speaker, to this approach. First, our immediate focus, in just a minute, our immediate focus must be on helping those to whom we have direct obligations by evacuating UK nationals together with those Afghans who have assisted our efforts over the past 20 years. And I know the whole House will join me in paying tribute to the bravery and commitment of our Ambassador, Sir Laurie Bristow. I give way to the right honourable gentleman.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for giving way on that particular point. He will be aware that there are 228 missionaries in Afghanistan currently under sentence of death. Those missionaries need to be taken out of Afghanistan. Of course, there are tens of thousands of others who are under sentence of death and fear for their life. Will the Prime Minister assure the House that every effort will be made to bring back to safe haven people whose lives are under threat as a result of the catastrophe and foreign policy episode that has gone on in that country?
I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for raising the very needy case that he does, and I'm sure that colleagues across the House, literally every member, would I imagine, has received messages from people who know someone who needs to get out of Afghanistan. And I can tell the Right Honourable Gentleman that we are doing everything we can to help out of that country those people to whom we owe, Mr. Speaker, a debt of obligation. And on that point, I want to repeat my thanks, not just to Laurie Bristow, but also to the Commander on the ground, Brigadier Dan Blanchford, and the entire British team in Kabul. I can tell the House that we have so far, I'm going to make some progress, Mr. Speaker, we have so far secured the safe return of 306 UK nationals and 2,052 Afghan nationals as part of our resettlement programme, with a further 2,000 Afghan applications completed and many more being processed. UK officials are working round the clock to keep the exit door open in the most difficult circumstances and actively seeking those we believe are eligible but as yet unregistered. And I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
I thank him for giving way. Can you explain then how many people he think are still eligible for relocation and have still to sign up? And he says they're doing everything they can to get these people out. So what does everything they can mean? How are they identifying these people, where they are, especially if they're already in hiding in fear of their lives?
That's why, Mr. Speaker, it's been so important that we maintain a presence at Kabul airport, and that's why we've been getting the message out that we want people to come through. And as I said, Mr. Speaker, earlier on, it is important for everybody to understand that at the moment, in the days that we have ahead of us, which may be short, but at the moment, this is an environment in which the Taliban are permitting this evacuation to take place. Mr. Speaker, these are interpreters, they are locally engaged staff and others who have risked their lives supporting our military efforts and seeking to secure new freedoms for their country. We are proud to bring these brave Afghans to our shores, and we continue to appeal for more to come forward. And I give way with pleasure.
I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister. The Home Secretary announced this morning that that the UK will be taking 20,000 refugees from Afghanistan, but that only 5,000 will be able to come this year. What are the 15,000 meant to do? Hang around and wait until they've been executed?
Yeah, exactly.
Mr. Speaker, that's the 5,000 on whom we're spending $200 million to bring a further 5,000 on top of the, I think it will be 10,000 altogether that we bring in under the ARAP and other programmes. We will be increasing that number over the coming years to, as I said, to 20,000. But the bulk of the effort of this country will be directed and should be directed, Mr. Speaker, to supporting people in Afghanistan and in the region, Mr. Speaker, in order to prevent a worse humanitarian crisis. And I believe, and may I tell the House that in that conviction, I am supported very strongly both by President Macron of France and by Chancellor Merkel of Germany. We are also, Mr. Speaker, doing everything possible to accelerate the visas for the
The member for Hyndburn can't be like a drone in the chamber, completely above everybody all the way through. Stand up and down, please, not just hover. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I was telling the House that we are making sure that we bring back the 35 brilliant evening scholars so that they can come and study in our great universities. We're deploying an additional 800 British troops to support this evacuation operation, and I can assure the House that we will continue this operation for as long as conditions at the airport allow, and I will give way to the Honourable Lady.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, as of last week, it was still Home Office policy that we would send people back to Kabul because we thought Kabul was safe. Can the Prime Minister now also confirm it's not just about people coming out of Afghanistan, it's about keeping people safe here, and we will not send people back to this nightmare?
she's entirely right. We will not be sending people back to Afghanistan, and nor, by the way, Mr. Speaker, will be allowing people to come from Afghanistan to this country in an indiscriminate way. We want to be generous, but we must make sure that we look after our own security. And over the coming weeks, we will redouble our efforts, working with others to protect the UK homeland and all our citizens and interests from any threat that may emanate from a Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, from terrorism to the narcotics trade. And I give way to my honourable friend,
Mr. Forgiving Way, does he agree with me that we have to do everything we can to support those who have supported us, like the Royal Marine Pen Farthing and his NALZ charity of veterinary staff and their immediate family who now need safe passage back to the UK?
Mr. Speaker, I think, like many of us, I have been extensively lobbied on behalf of the excellent work done by Mr. Pen Farthing. I'm well aware of his cause, all the wonderful things that he has done. And for animals in Afghanistan, I can tell my honourable friend that we will do everything we can to help Mr. Pen Farthing and others who face particular difficulty like himself. But as I say, without in any way jeopardising our own national security. These are concerns shared across the international community, from the region itself to all the NATO alliance and indeed all 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. And I will chair a virtual meeting of the G7 in the coming days. Third, Mr. Speaker, we also have an enduring commitment to all the Afghan people, and now more than ever we must reaffirm that commitment. Our efforts must be focused on supporting the Afghan people in the region itself, particularly those fleeing conflict or the threat of violence. We therefore call on the United Nations to lead a new humanitarian effort in this region. And I give way to the Right Honourable Lady Opposite.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way, and I welcome his commitment to support in the region and also the Government's commitment to a resettlement programme. But could he confirm the Home Secretary announced in 2019 that the UK would continue a resettlement scheme of 5,000 refugees a year after the Syrian scheme closed? Could he confirm that the announcement today of an Afghan resettlement scheme is in addition to that existing 5,000 resettlement commitment, as opposed to simply being a refocusing or a displacement of that existing 5,000 a year resettlement programme?
I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady Opposite, because I think she's asked a question that formed itself in many people's minds about the 5,000s. And yes, indeed, the 5,000 that extra in the resettlement scheme are additional to those already announced. And we will support those people in coming to this country. We will also support the wider international community in delivering on humanitarian projects in the region by doubling, Mr. Speaker, the amount of humanitarian and development assistance that we had previously committed to Afghanistan this year, with new funding, wait for it, Mr. Speaker, taking this up to £286 million with immediate effect. And we call on others, £286 million with immediate effect, and we call on others to work together on a shared humanitarian effort, focusing on helping the most vulnerable in what will be formidably difficult circumstances. And I give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm grateful to the Prime Minister, and he is being very generous with his time. Over the past 20 years, there have been some 50 NATO and partner nations that have been involved in Afghanistan. I welcome the measures that have been proposed by the UK and other countries such as the US, Canada, France, Germany, and so on. However, there are many countries still who have been involved in Afghanistan in recent years who have still yet to come to the plate and to recognise their responsibility in helping these people at this desperate time. Would the Prime Minister inform the House what is being done to encourage these other countries to take up their responsibility and help these people in Afghanistan?
My right honourable friend makes an excellent point, Mr. Speaker, and that's why the UK has chaired the Security Council of the UN and asked to put a motion together with our French friends to get the world to focus on the humanitarian needs of Afghanistan, and we'll be doing the same thing in NATO, in the G7 and the other bodies in which we have a leadership role. And we want all these countries to step up, as he rightly says, Mr. Speaker, and focus on the most vulnerable in what will be formidably difficult circumstances. Fourth, Mr. Speaker, I've given away, I think you'll agree, quite a lot already this morning, and I know that thanks to the generosity of yourself, Mr. Speaker, and the House, there is now ample time for debate until later on this afternoon, where I think many members will be able to get their points across. I therefore intend, Mr. Speaker, by your leave, to make some progress. Fourth, while we must focus on the region itself, we will also create safe and legal routes for those Afghans most in need to come and settle here in the UK. So in addition to those Afghans with whom we've worked directly, I can announce today that we're committing to relocating another 5,000 Afghans this year with a new and bespoke resettlement scheme focusing on the most vulnerable, particularly women and children. And we will keep this under review for future years, with the potential of accommodating up to 20,000 over the long term. And so, taken together, Mr. Speaker, I've been very generous with my interventions. I think you will agree already, and I've made my position clear. Taken together, Mr. Speaker, we are committing almost £500 million of humanitarian funding to support the Afghan people. Fifth, Mr. Speaker, we must also face the reality of a change of regime in Afghanistan. And as President of the G7, the UK will work to unite the international community behind a clear plan for dealing with this regime in a unified and concerted way. Over the last 3 days, I've spoken with the NATO and UN Secretaries General, with President Biden, with Chancellor Merkel, with President Macron and Prime Minister Khan. We are clear and we have agreed that it would be a mistake for any country to recognise any new regime in Kabul prematurely or bilaterally. Instead, those countries that care about Afghanistan's future should work towards common conditions about the conduct of the new regime before deciding, together, whether to recognise it and on what terms. We will judge this regime based on the choices it makes and by its actions rather than by its words. On its attitude to terrorism, to crime and narcotics, as well as humanitarian access and the rights of girls to receive an education. Defending human rights will remain of the highest priority, and we will use every available political and diplomatic means to ensure that those human rights remain at the top of the international agenda. Mr. Speaker, our United Kingdom has a roll call of honour that bears the names of 457 servicemen and women who gave their lives in some of the world's harshest terrain, and many others who bear injuries to this day, fighting in what had become the epicentre of global terrorism. And even amid the heart-wrenching scenes we see today, I believe they should be proud of their achievements. And we should be deeply proud of them, because they conferred benefits that are lasting and ineradicable on millions of people in one of the poorest countries on earth. And they provided vital protection for 2 decades to this country and the rest of the world. They gave their all for our safety, and we owe it to them to give our all to prevent Afghanistan from once again becoming a breeding ground for terrorism. Because no matter how grim the lessons of the past, the future is not yet written. And at this bleak turning point, we must help the people of Afghanistan to choose the best of all their possible futures. And in the UN, the G7, in NATO, with friends and partners around the world, That is the critical task on which this government is now urgently engaged and will be engaged in the days to come.
The question is that this House has considered the situation in Afghanistan. Can I suggest the backbenchers will be starting with 7 minutes? And now I call on the Leader of the Opposition, the Right Honourable Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank you and the staff for recalling Parliament for today's debate. Before I get to the urgent issue at hand, let me join you, Mr Speaker, and the Prime Minister in condemning the appalling shootings in Plymouth last week. We all send our condolences to the bereaved families. We must resolve to ensure that firearms do not get into the hands of dangerous people, and finally to get to grips with the way that hate thrives on the internet. Turning to Afghanistan, Mr Speaker, it's been a disastrous week, an unfolding tragedy. 20 years ago, the Taliban were largely in control of Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda were using the country as a training ground and a base for terror, including plotting the horrific 9/11 attack. There were widespread human rights abuses. Girls were denied an education. Women couldn't work. Being gay was punishable by death, all imposed without democracy. Since then, a fragile democracy emerged. Mr Speaker, it was by no means perfect, but no international terrorist attacks have been mounted from Afghanistan in that period. Women have gained liberty and won office. Schools and clinics have been built, and Afghans have allowed themselves to dream of a better future. Mr Speaker, those achievements were born of sacrifice. Sacrifice by the Afghan people, who bravely fought alongside their NATO allies, and British sacrifice. Over 150,000 UK personnel have served in Afghanistan, including members across this House, including the honourable and gallant members for Tunbridge and Malling, for Barnsley Central, Plymouth Moorview, Norwich South, Aldershot, the Isle of Wight, Filton and Bradley Stoke, and Wells. They and the tens of thousands of others deployed in Afghanistan served in difficult and challenging circumstances. And the Labour Party, and I'm sure everybody across this House, thanks each and every one of them, of the 150,000. Many returned with life-changing injuries. And tragically, 457 didn't return at all. I'll just make progress and then I will.
Later today, I'll be attending the service at RAF Lynham, outside Rolwyn Bassett, to commemorate the 10th anniversary, which falls today, of the last repatriation through Bassett. Will the Right Honourable Gentleman agree with me that the message to those people that I will see today must be not that these young lives are wasted, but that they played an absolutely essential role in deterring and destroying terrorism and carrying out so many other good works in Afghanistan?
I wholeheartedly agree with that, and will address it in just one moment. Thank you. Mr Speaker, for many of those who return from Afghanistan and other places around the world, mental health has been an all too familiar issue raised by veterans time and again. And the events of the last few days and weeks will have exacerbated the situation, reopening old wounds, and everybody across this House will have had examples of that. So we must improve mental health services for our veterans. Mr Speaker, in addressing the very point that's just been made, I want to address directly all those who served in Afghanistan and their families, especially the families of those who were lost. Your sacrifice was not in vain. Your sacrifice was not in vain. You brought stability, reduced the terrorist threat, and enabled progress. We are all proud of what you did. Your sacrifice deserves better than this, and so do the Afghan people. Mr. Speaker, there's been a major miscalculation of the resilience of the Afghan forces and staggering complacency from our government about the Taliban threat. The result is that the Taliban are now back in control of Afghanistan. The gains made through 20 years of sacrifice hang precariously. Women and girls fear for their liberty. Afghan civilians are holding onto the undercarriage of NATO aircraft, literally clinging to departing hope. And we face new threats to our security and an appalling humanitarian crisis. I will.
Grateful to the right honourable gentleman for all the reasons he mentioned. Doesn't he agree that President Biden is actually wrong when he talks about American sacrifices in a civil war? The Taliban is not at war with a regime. The Taliban is at war with the civilised values of justice, equality and tolerance that all of us hold dear, and against which it respects no international boundaries.
I would agree with that intervention and thank the honourable member for it. Mr. Speaker, I'll just make some progress and then I will, of course. Mr. Speaker, the desperate situation requires leadership and for the Prime Minister to snap out of his complacency. The most urgent task is the protection of our diplomatic staff still working heroically in Kabul and the evacuation of British nationals and Afghans who've risked their lives. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear, the Labour Party fully supports the deployment of troops to this end. We want it to succeed just as quickly and safely as possible. The Defence Secretary has said that some people who've worked with us will not get back. Unconscionable. The government, in one moment I will, the government must outline a plan to work with our allies to do everything that's possible to ensure that does not happen. Guarantee that our troops have the resources they need to carry out their mission effectively and as safely as possible, and work to provide stable security at the airport in Kabul so that flights can depart and visas can be processed. We all know how difficult that is. We all know how hard everybody is working on the ground, and we fully support it. And I raise an issue not by way of criticism, but just to get some reassurance, because there are reports this morning from NGOs that an evacuation plane left almost empty this morning because evacuees couldn't get to the airport to get to that plane. As I say, we are not challenging the work on the ground. We know how difficult it is, but at some appropriate moment I would like to see that addressed. If true. I will, yes.
Grateful to the right honourable gentleman for giving way. Can I just bring him back to the statement by the President of the United States the other day? Does he not agree with me that this took on the terms, really, of a sort of shameful excuse? When he blames the Afghan armed forces, who have lost nearly 70,000 in trying to defend Afghan, when corruption had stripped away much of their pay, their money, their support, and the American decision to withdraw the aircraft cover was almost certainly going to lead us, does he not think that that is shameful?
Mr. Speaker, the US is of course an important ally, but to overlook the fighting of the Afghan troops and forces in recent years, they have been at the forefront of that fighting, I think is wrong for any of us to overlook all the situation that they now find themselves in. Mr. Speaker, the urgent task is of course the evacuation. Equally urgent is the immediate refugee crisis. I'll just make some progress and then I will. Many Afghans have bravely sought to rebuild their country. They did so on a promise of democratic freedoms, the rule of law and liberty for the oppressed, including women and girls. They are our friends, and that was our promise. They are now fearing for their lives. We do not turn our backs on friends at their time of need. We owe an obligation to the people of Afghanistan. There should be a resettlement scheme for people to rebuild their lives here. Safe and legal routes. It must be a resettlement scheme that meets the scale of the enormous challenge. But what the government has announced this morning does not do that. It is vague. It will support just 5,000 in the first year, a number without rationale. Was that based on a risk assessment of those most at need, or was it plucked out of the air? Others, the offer to others in one moment, the offer to others is in the long term, But for those desperately needing our help now, there is no long term, Mr. Speaker. Just day-to-day survival. Yet again, this government... I will give way.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way, as well as the need for a much more bold and ambitious resettlement programme. Would he agree with me that this disaster must mark a turning point for our failed asylum system, in particular getting rid of the so-called hostile environment and the Nationality and Borders Bill, under which a woman fleeing the Taliban with her children on a boat across the Channel would be criminalised? Does he agree that that bill must now be revised?
Thank you for that intervention. I'm going to come on to the specifics of the system, because yet again this government seems ill-prepared and unwilling, just as it has been too slow to provide sanctuary to Afghans who've served alongside Britain. Too many reports of eligible Afghans facing bureaucratic hurdles and too many unfairly excluded. Mr. Speaker, knowing the date of withdrawal was coming for months, the Home Office is not close to completing the process they've already got up and running. It was designed to help 7,000 people, yet Home Office figures this week showed only 2,000 have been helped so far. I will give way.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and the point that I wanted to make indeed to the Prime Minister was the situation facing Afghan Sikhs. Now, I know from my own constituency casework that there are Afghan Sikhs in the system at the moment waiting for clearance from the Home Office. So one of the things I would like to call on the government to do is to process those as quickly as possible and not leave all those people in the system waiting any longer than they have to at the moment. They are terrified with the idea of being sent back home, and despite the reassurance given to my honourable friend, I do not see any movement from the Home Office to give these people the legal status that they need.
I'm grateful for that intervention, and there have been other examples across the House of individuals and groups who are very obviously at risk in Afghanistan and need to come out just as quickly as possible. And that's, Mr. Speaker, where the question arises to what's behind the 5,000 number and why the others are having to wait so long. Mr. Speaker, the scale of the refugee crisis requires an international response, but we must lead it, and lead with a resettlement programme that meets the scale of the challenge. The scheme must be generous and welcoming. If it's not, we know the consequences. We know the consequences now. Violent reprisals in Afghanistan, people tragically fleeing into the arms of human traffickers. We know this is what will happen. More people risking and losing their lives on unsafe journeys, including across the English Channel. We cannot betray our friends. We must lead. I will.
For him giving way. He speaks of people fleeing, but what we have yet to assess is whether anyone outside of Kabul is able to get to somewhere of safety. Does he agree that now a safe corridor needs to be opened to an international border so that those who are not near Kabul can also get to safety via third countries?
Well, I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for that intervention. And there is huge concern, as all members will know, about our line of sight beyond Kabul just at the moment. And again, that calls into question where the 5,000 number comes from, because we're not even in a position to assess at the moment the position outside of Kabul. We cannot betray our friends. We must lead. Mr. Speaker, I will.
The government of this kingdom to be overthrown by a wicked and brutal regime. I venture that he would want a leading role in the resistance. He wouldn't be queuing at the airport, would he?
When I was Director of Public Prosecutions, I had some of my prosecutors in Afghanistan at huge risk working on counter-terrorism with other brave souls there. So I won't take that from him or anybody else. Mr. Speaker, once these immediate challenges are addressed, we face an uncertain and difficult future. The Taliban are back in control, and we cannot be naive about the consequences. We've lost our primary source of leverage in political discussions, and everything we've achieved in the last 20 years is now under threat. I'm going to make some progress, and then I will give way. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is right to say that we cannot allow Afghanistan to become a training ground for violent hate and terrorism. But that will be more difficult now that Afghanistan has descended into chaos. But if preventing al-Qaeda camps is now the limit of our ambition, we are betraying 20 years of sacrifice by our armed forces, and we're betraying the Afghan people who cannot be left to the cruelty of the Taliban. I will.
Very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. He speaks about the lack of ambition and the lack of urgency, which of course summarise.
And that, of course, was the UK statement on the ongoing developments in Afghanistan, where the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson clearly said that there is no military action appetite when it comes to developments in Afghanistan with the UK or its partners. He also said that humanitarian aid to Afghanistan will be doubled in the coming weeks and months, and also that 20,000 Afghans will be permitted to enter the UK under the resettlement scheme. WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.